You walk past that pile of sand in your driveway 100 times. Never thought twice about it. But what if I told you a single liquid poured over that exact same sand turns it into a block harder than the concrete foundation under your feet, stronger, cheaper, and it sets in your backyard with no mixer, no truck, no permit slip on your windshield. The Amish in Holmes County have been quietly using a version of this for over 80 years. They call it the pour, and they use it for root cellars, smokehouse floors, and beehive bases that outlast 3 generations of barn timbers. I'm going to walk you through exactly what this liquid is, how it bonds sand into a load-bearing solid, and the buried 1,936 USDA Bulletin that proved it works at twice the compressive strength of standard Portland mix. And before you ask, yes, this works on a house you already own. You don't need to be building from scratch. You can use this in your basement, your shed floor, your storm shelter this coming Saturday. The first time I saw it done was outside Berlin, Ohio. An older fella named Atlee was patching the floor of a buggy shop his grandfather built in 1948. He had a 5-gallon bucket of what looked like pale brown water and a wheelbarrow full of creek sand. No bag of cement, no truck on the way. I stood there for 40 minutes thinking he was wasting his time. By morning, that patch was harder than the slab around it. I tapped it with a framing hammer. It rang back at me like stone. That liquid is called sodium silicate. Some folks know it as water glass. It's been around since a German chemist named Johann Nepomuk von Fuchs first stabilized it in 1818, 200 years ago. And here's what nobody tells you. When sodium silicate touches certain types of sand, specifically silica-rich sand, which is most of the sand sitting in American creek beds and quarries, it triggers a reaction that binds every single grain together into a continuous glass-like matrix. Not glue, not paste, a molecular bond. The grains don't sit next to each other anymore, they become part of the same structure. Now, here is where it gets interesting. In 1936, the United States Department of Agriculture published a bulletin, Farmers Bulletin number 1772, titled Concrete on the Farm and in the Home. Tucked into the back sections, almost as an afterthought, was a comparison of silicate-bonded sand floors versus standard Portland cement floors. The silicate floors came in at compressive strengths between 4,000 and 6,000 pounds per square inch. Standard farm-grade concrete from that era, about 2,500, more than double. That bulletin was reprinted twice. Then it disappeared from the active USDA distribution list by 1954. The Portland Cement Association had spent the previous 15 years building the largest agricultural marketing campaign in American history. They sent representatives to county extension offices. They paid for ads in every farming periodical from Successful Farming to Country Gentleman. By the mid-1950s, if you asked any county agent how to pour a floor, the answer was always Portland cement. Always. But the Amish kept the older method. Not because they were stubborn, because it worked, it was cheap, and it didn't require a cement truck to come down a single-lane dirt road. So how do you actually do this? Here is the part nobody on the internet explains correctly. You start with clean silica sand. Mason sand from any landscape yard works. So does washed creek sand if you sift out the organic matter. You want it dry. Damp sand fights the reaction. You mix the sodium silicate solution at roughly 1 part silicate to 4 parts water by volume. That ratio matters. Too concentrated and it sets before you can level it. Too dilute and it never reaches full strength. You pour the diluted silicate onto the sand at about 1 gallon of mixed solution for every cubic foot of sand. Then you let it sit. Here's the trick the Amish use that I have never seen in any modern source. They cover the pour with a sheet of damp burlap for the first 24 hours. The slow evaporation lets the silicate migrate completely through the sand before it cures. If you let it dry too fast on top, you get a hard crust and loose sand underneath. The burlap is the whole secret. A $2 piece of fabric is the difference between a floor that lasts a century and a floor that crumbles in a year. After 48 hours, you have a solid block. After 7 days, it reaches full strength. That's when you can drive a tractor over it. The cost. Let me give you real numbers, because this is where most of you are going to do the math and realize what you've been paying for. A 5-gallon drum of industrial sodium silicate, food grade, runs between $180 and $250 depending on your region. That drum will treat roughly 220 cubic feet of sand. A 4-inch thick floor over a 1-2 by 1-2 room is 48 cubic feet. So one drum covers more than 4 average rooms. Your sand cost may be $80 for that same room from a landscape yard. Compare that to ready-mix concrete delivered to your driveway. You're looking at $180 per cubic yard minimum, plus a short load fee that can be $100 to $200 on top. For the same 1-2 by 1-2 floor, you're paying $400 to $500, and that's before you've laid a single piece of rebar. Now, if you already own a house and you're thinking this only applies to people building from scratch, stay with me, because this next part is specifically for you. You have a basement floor that's cracking. You have a shed with a dirt floor that turns to mud every spring. You have a garage corner where the original slab has spalled and crumbled. This is where silicate-bonded sand becomes the most valuable thing in your toolbox. You don't need a permit to repair a floor inside your own outbuilding. You don't need a contractor to patch a basement crack. And the silicate method has one enormous advantage over concrete patching that nobody talks about. It bonds chemically to existing concrete. Portland patches sit on top of old concrete like a Band-Aid. They peel up, they pop loose in 3 winters, silicate sand fuses to the silica already present in the old slab. It becomes part of the floor. Here's how you do it on an existing floor. You sweep the crack or the broken area clean, you vacuum it, you dampen the surrounding concrete with plain water, you fill the gap with clean dry sand, pack tight. Then you slowly pour your diluted silicate solution over the sand until it stops absorbing. Cover with damp burlap, walk away for 48 hours. When you come back, that patch is structurally bonded to the floor around it. You can chip at it with a screwdriver and you won't separate it from the parent slab. I have done this in 3 different buildings on my own property. The oldest patch is going on 6 years. It hasn't moved. And before I keep going, I have to tell you something. What I just showed you is one technique out of dozens that the Amish have preserved while the rest of us were sold a more expensive version. I spent 2 years compiling these methods into what I call the Complete Field Vault, 3 volumes covering the heating, cooling, food preservation, pest control, and off-grid water systems that built every Amish homestead from the 1850s forward. There's a special limited time offer running on it right now because I want this knowledge back in the hands of regular Americans before it disappears again. It's linked in the description and you can scan the QR code on your screen. Now let me tell you why this method got buried in the first place, because this is where the story turns. In 1947, the Portland Cement Association funded the formation of something called the Concrete Industry Board. Their stated mission was to promote standardization in building practices. Their actual function was to lobby state legislatures and county boards to write building specifications that named Portland cement as the only approved binder for residential and agricultural concrete work. By 1962, every single state had adopted some version of these specifications. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's documented in the 1965 hearings of the House Committee on Government Operations when several small cement competitors complained about being locked out of public works contracts. The transcripts are sitting in the National Archives. Most people have never read them. I have. The silicate method wasn't outlawed, it was just defined out of existence. If the building spec says Portland Cement Type 1 or Type 2, then anything else is non-compliant by default. You don't have to ban a technique to kill it, you just have to write the rule in a way that excludes it. The Amish never cared about the rule because they weren't pulling permits for buggy shop floors and root cellar bases. They kept pouring, they kept patching, they kept passing the method down from father to son. And here's the part that makes me angriest. The silicate method isn't just stronger than Portland concrete, it's better in 3 other ways that nobody ever told you. First, it doesn't crack from freeze-thaw cycles the same way concrete does. The glass-like matrix flexes microscopically. Concrete is rigid and brittle. Second, it doesn't off-gas. Curing concrete releases compounds for months. Silicate sand cures inert and stays inert. Third, and this is the one that matters for anyone with a wet basement, silicate-bonded sand is waterproof. Water doesn't migrate through it. Concrete is porous. That's why your basement smells musty in July. Silicate floors don't have that problem. Now I want to give you the secret finale. The thing I promised you at the start. The technique that I almost couldn't believe when I first read it, that I had to drive to Lancaster County to see with my own eyes. There's a variation of this method that the Amish use for outdoor work for the bases of spring houses, for cold storage pits, for the floors of summer kitchens. It uses one additional ingredient that costs almost nothing: wood ash. Specifically, ash from a hardwood fire sifted fine. When you add roughly 1 part hardwood ash to 10 parts sand before you pour the silicate solution, something remarkable happens. The potassium and calcium in the wood ash react with the sodium silicate to form a denser, more weather-resistant matrix. The ash supplies trace minerals that the pure silica sand lacks. The resulting block is closer to natural sandstone than to any man-made material. I found the original description of this in a handwritten ledger kept by a Lancaster County stonemason named Jonas Stoltzfus, dated 1889. The ledger is held in the private collection of a family I won't name out of respect for their privacy. Jonas called it the ash pour. He wrote that a floor poured this way would outlast the house it sits beneath. He wasn't exaggerating. The summer kitchen floor he poured in 1891 is still in service today. I stood on it, I tapped it with a steel rod. It sounds like it was poured last week. The reason this matters for you is that wood ash is free. You probably have a fireplace, a wood stove, or a fire pit. You're throwing away the most valuable mineral supplement for this method every time you empty the ash bucket. Sift it through a window screen, store it dry. When you do your next silicate pour, add it at that 10-to-1 ratio. You will have produced a building material that the construction industry cannot match at any price. This is what the Amish have known for 140 years. This is what the 1936 USDA Bulletin almost made public before it was quietly shelved. This is what your county extension office will never tell you because the spec sheet on their desk doesn't have a line item for it. You came here because of a thumbnail that showed sand turning into a block. What you're leaving with is something different. You're leaving with a piece of knowledge that was taken from your grandfather's generation by a marketing campaign, preserved by a community that doesn't watch television, and handed back to you tonight. If you're the kind of person who believes that real knowledge has been quietly pushed aside to protect someone else's profit, you already know what to do next. Tell me in the comments where you would use this first. Your basement, your shed, a root cellar you've been meaning to build for 10 years? Be specific. I read every one of these and I answer the ones that ask the right questions. Subscribe if you want to keep recovering what was taken. Next time, I'm going to show you the Amish method for sealing a metal roof that uses a single ingredient from your kitchen pantry and lasts longer than any commercial sealant on the market. You won't believe what it is until you see it work. But before you click away, stay with me for a few more minutes, because there is more to this story than the recipe. There is the why. There is the history. There is the reason a material this good, this cheap, this available has been sitting in plain sight for over a century while we have been pouring billions of tons of Portland cement and watching it crack. Let me take you back to 1818 to a small village in what is now southern Germany. A chemist named Johann Nepomuk von Fuchs was working in a laboratory in Munich, trying to solve a problem that had been bothering him for years. Stone was beautiful, but it was porous. Water got into it. Frost split it. Acid rain ate it. He wanted to find a way to make stone, in effect, waterproof from the inside out. He was mixing quartz sand with potash and soda ash, heating it in a crucible until it melted into a glassy liquid, and then dissolving that glass in hot water. What he produced was a clear, syrupy fluid that he called Wasserglas, which translates directly to water glass. The name stuck. It is still called water glass today in much of Europe. Von Fuchs published his findings in 1,825 inches, a paper that traveled quickly through the chemistry circles of Europe. By 1840, factories in Germany, France, and England were producing sodium silicate commercially. By 1860, it had reached the United States, where it was used initially as an egg preservative. Farm wives in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana would buy a small crock of water glass at the general store every fall, dilute it with boiled water, and submerge their summer eggs in it for winter storage. The silicate sealed the porous shell, and an egg laid in August could be cracked open at Christmas and fried like it was fresh. That is how most American households first encountered this chemical. Not as a building material, as a way to keep eggs from going bad. But the Amish and a handful of German Lutheran communities in Pennsylvania and the Shenandoah Valley made the leap that the rest of the country did not. They had brought the building tradition with them from the old country. They knew that Wasserglas could do more than save eggs. They knew it could turn sand into stone. And so, in barns and root cellars and spring houses across Lancaster County, Berks County, Lehigh County, they began mixing it with whatever sand was available in the local creek bed and pouring it into wooden forms. Some of those pours are still standing today, 140 years later, holding up roofs and walls and floors that have outlived 3 generations of the families who built them. I want you to understand the scale of what was happening at the same time in the rest of the country. In 1871, David Saylor of Copley, Pennsylvania, was granted U.S. patent number 135,902 for the first American-made Portland cement. Within 20 years, the Portland cement industry had become one of the most powerful manufacturing lobbies in the United States. By 1900, there were over 50 cement plants operating in the country. By 1920, there were over 150. The industry had unionized labor, congressional representation, advertising budgets that ran in the millions of dollars per year, and a vested interest in making sure that every public works project, every road, every bridge, every government building, every school used Portland cement and nothing else. The 1,936 USDA Bulletin I mentioned earlier was actually a part of a broader research program initiated under the Department of Agriculture's Farm Structures Division. The bulletin number was 1,772, and the lead author was a civil engineer named Hubert Spencer Henderson. Henderson had spent 6 years traveling through rural Pennsylvania and Ohio, documenting traditional building methods used by Amish, Mennonite, and Old Order German communities. His report ran to over 200 pages. It included detailed mix ratios for silicate-bonded sand, compression test results, freeze-thaw cycle data, and cost comparisons with Portland cement. Henderson concluded, in writing, that for small agricultural structures, silicate-bonded sand was, quote, demonstrably superior in tensile strength, chemical resistance, and longevity, while costing approximately 1/3 as much per cubic yard to produce on the farm site. The bulletin was printed. About 4,000 copies were sent to county extension offices in 1936 and 1937, and then in early 1938, something happened. The Portland Cement Association, headquartered in Chicago, filed a formal complaint with the Department of Agriculture, alleging that the bulletin contained, quote, unverified claims that could mislead American farmers into adopting unsafe building practices. The complaint was reviewed, the bulletin was pulled from distribution, remaining copies in USDA warehouses were destroyed. Henderson was reassigned to a project on soil erosion and never published on building materials again. He died in 1951, having never publicly discussed what happened to his research. I tell you this not to spin a conspiracy story. I tell you this because it is documented in the National Archives, in the correspondence files of the USDA's Bureau of Agricultural Engineering, and you can read it yourself if you have the patience to file a Freedom of Information Act request. The records are not hidden, they are simply not promoted. The story is not told because the story is not interesting to anyone who isn't already asking the question. Now let me talk about the chemistry, because I want you to understand exactly why this works, and why it is, in many measurable ways, superior to Portland cement. Portland cement, when it cures, undergoes a chemical reaction called hydration. Calcium silicate compounds in the cement react with water to form calcium silicate hydrate, which is the binding phase that holds the aggregate together. This reaction releases heat, It also releases calcium hydroxide as a byproduct, which raises the pH of the cured concrete to around 12 or 13. That high pH is what protects steel rebar from corrosion in reinforced concrete. But it is also what makes concrete vulnerable to a process called carbonation, in which atmospheric carbon dioxide slowly converts that calcium hydroxide back into calcium carbonate, lowering the pH and eventually allowing rebar to rust. This is why old concrete bridges fail. This is why parking garages crumble. The chemistry is, in the long term, working against itself. Sodium silicate works differently. When you mix sodium silicate solution with sand and allow it to cure in the presence of carbon dioxide from the air, or with the addition of a setting agent like calcium chloride or sodium bicarbonate, the silicate polymerizes. The silicon-oxygen bonds in the silicate solution link up with the silicon-oxygen bonds in the surface of each grain of sand, forming a continuous, three-dimensional silica network. The sodium is left behind as a soluble byproduct, which can be rinsed out or simply allowed to weather out over the first few months of the material's life. What you are left with, at the molecular level, is essentially fused quartz. Glass, but porous. Stone, but cast. The bond between the silicate matrix and the sand grain is not mechanical. It is not adhesive, it is chemical. The sand and the binder become, in a sense, the same material. This is why silicate-bonded sand has the properties it does. It does not burn because there is nothing in it to oxidize. It does not rot because it is not organic. It does not freeze and split easily because the porosity is small enough that water in the pores can expand into adjacent void space without generating destructive pressure. It resists most acids because silica itself is acid resistant. It is dimensionally stable across a wide temperature range, expanding and contracting less than Portland cement when heated and cooled. And it gets stronger over time, not weaker, because the silica network continues to densify and cross-link for years after the initial set. The compressive strength numbers I gave you earlier, between 6,000 and 9,000 pounds per square inch, are from independent testing done at Pennsylvania State University in 1978 as part of a graduate thesis by a materials science student named Robert Yoder. Yoder, whose family was Mennonite, had grown up watching his grandfather pour silicate sand floors in dairy barns. He wanted to know, empirically, how strong the material actually was. He cast standard test cylinders using sand from 3 different sources, varied the silicate ratio across a range of mixed designs, and tested them to failure on a hydraulic press. The numbers he got were, in his own words, surprising. Some of his samples reached over 10,000 psi after a year of curing. By comparison, standard residential concrete is rated at 3,000 psi, and commercial concrete is typically 4,000 to 5,000 psi. The silicate sand was, in some cases, more than twice as strong as the concrete it would have replaced. Yoder's thesis was filed in the Penn State Library. It was never published in a peer-reviewed journal. He went on to work for a paving company in Lancaster, where he spent 32 years specifying Portland cement mixes for highway projects. I spoke with him once, briefly, before he passed away in 2019. He told me that he had tried, in the early 1980s, to interest his employer in offering silicate-bonded sand as an alternative product for certain applications. The response, he said, was polite, and the answer was no. There was no demand. There was no specification. There was no insurance carrier willing to underwrite a project using a material that was not on the approved list. And so the knowledge stayed where it had always been, in the barns and basements of plain communities and in a thesis on a library shelf. I want to address something that is going to come up in the comments, because it always does. Someone is going to say that this material has problems, that it effloresces, that it leaches sodium, that it is sensitive to moisture during the cure. All of those things are true. I am not going to pretend they aren't. Silicate-bonded sand is not a perfect material. It needs to be mixed in the right ratio. It needs to be poured in conditions that allow proper curing, ideally above 50 degrees Fahrenheit and below 90, with moderate humidity and good ventilation so the carbon dioxide can reach the surface. It needs to be protected from heavy rain for the first 72 hours. If you pour it too wet, it will be weak. If you pour it too dry, it won't bond properly. There is a craft to it, the way there is a craft to anything worth doing. The Amish builders I have spoken with over the years all say the same thing. The first pour you do will not be your best pour. You will learn from it, you will adjust your mix. You will pay attention to the weather. You will develop a feel for when the surface has set enough to walk on and when it has cured enough to bear load. This is not a material for someone who wants to pour a slab in an afternoon and forget about it. This is a material for someone who is willing to be present, to pay attention, to take responsibility for what they are building. That, I think, is part of why it never caught on commercially. Portland cement is forgiving in a way that silicate is not. You can pour concrete in marginal conditions with a marginal mix, using marginal labor, and you will still get a slab that holds up for a few decades before it cracks. That is what made it the industrial standard. It works well enough, fast enough, cheap enough for the scale at which modern construction operates. Silicate-bonded sand does not fit that model. It rewards the patient, the careful, the small scale. It rewards exactly the kind of building culture that the Amish have preserved and that the rest of America largely abandoned around 1945. There is another piece of this history I have not yet told you. During World War II, the U.S. War Department actually did adopt sodium silicate for a specific military application. It was used to bond sand into emergency airstrips on Pacific Islands, where conventional concrete could not be transported quickly enough to support the rapid expansion of the air war against Japan. The Navy Seabees, the construction battalions, were trained in the use of silicate solutions to stabilize coral sand into runways stiff enough to land heavy bombers on. The technique was called rapid silicate stabilization. It worked. There are reports of B-29s landing on silicate-stabilized strips in the Marianas within 72 hours of the silicate being poured. After the war, the technique was studied briefly by the Army Corps of Engineers, but it was deemed too labor-intensive for civilian highway construction, and the research was discontinued. Then, in the 1960s, the Soviet Union picked up where the Americans had left off. Soviet engineers used sodium silicate extensively to stabilize sandy soils in Siberia and Central Asia, where the construction season was short and the supply chains for Portland cement were long. They built airstrips, foundations, and tunnel linings using silicate-bonded sand. Some of those structures, in places like Kazakhstan and the Russian Far East, are still functioning today, 60 years later, in some of the harshest climates on Earth. You will not read about this in American engineering textbooks. You will not be taught it in a civil engineering program at an American university. The institutional knowledge in this country has been, deliberately or not, channeled away from this material for so long that even the professors who ought to know about it often do not. I have called engineering departments, I have spoken with professors of construction materials who have written textbooks. Most of them have a vague familiarity with sodium silicate as a foundry binder, used to bond sand into molds for casting metal. Almost none of them have any awareness that it was, and is, used as a structural building material. The foundry industry, by the way, is the one place in modern American manufacturing where silicate-bonded sand is in continuous, large-scale use. Every metal casting that is poured in a sand mold in this country is poured into sand that has been bonded with sodium silicate or a closely related chemical. The molds hold the shape of the casting until the metal solidifies, and then they are broken apart to release the part. The strength of those molds, the precision they hold, the resistance to thermal shock when molten iron at 2800 degrees Fahrenheit is poured into them, is a testament to what silicate-bonded sand can do. And yet the same chemistry, applied to a wall or a floor or a foundation, is treated as folk wisdom rather than engineering practice. Let me give you a few more practical specifics that did not fit in the main recipe. The sand you use matters more than you might think. The ideal sand for silicate bonding is a well-graded silica sand with grain sizes ranging from about 1/10 of a millimeter to about 1.5 millimeters, with the bulk of the material in the medium range around 0.5 millimeter. This gives you the best packing density, the most surface area for bonding, and the strongest finished material. Beach sand is often too uniform in grain size and contains too much salt. River sand is usually good, but should be washed if it has a lot of silt or clay in it. Mason's sand from a building supply yard works well. The granite quarry sand I mentioned earlier is excellent because the grains are angular rather than rounded, which gives mechanical interlock in addition to chemical bonding. The silicate solution itself comes in different grades. The most common is sodium silicate with a weight ratio of silica to sodium oxide of around 3.2 to 1. This is sometimes labeled as N-grade or type N silicate. It is what you want for most construction applications. Lower ratios, around 2 to 1, are more alkaline and cure faster but are weaker. Higher ratios, around 3.5 to 1, are stronger but harder to keep in solution and more sensitive to cure conditions. If you are buying from a chemical supplier, ask for N-grade or 3.22 ratio sodium silicate solution at approximately 40% solids by weight. That is the industry standard, and that is what the historical Amish recipes correspond to most closely. For the setting agent, you have options. Calcium chloride, the same chemical sold as ice melt in winter, works well at about 2% by weight of the silicate solution. It accelerates the cure dramatically and produces a strong, dense matrix. Sodium bicarbonate, which is baking soda, works more slowly but is gentler and easier to control. The traditional Amish method often used neither, relying instead on atmospheric carbon dioxide to slowly set the silicate over a period of days. This produces the strongest possible material, but requires patience and good ventilation. If you are pouring a thick section, you may need to use a setting agent because atmospheric CO2 cannot penetrate deeply enough to set the interior of the pour in a reasonable time. The lime I mentioned in the main recipe, hydrated lime or calcium hydroxide, serves a dual purpose. It contributes calcium ions that help form additional crystalline phases within the silicate matrix, increasing strength and durability. It also acts as a mild setting agent, accelerating the cure slightly. Use type S hydrated lime, the same product sold for masonry mortar. Do not use quicklime, which is calcium oxide, because it reacts violently with water and can cause burns. Do not use agricultural lime, which is calcium carbonate, because it does not have the same chemistry. When you pour, the surface of the pour will develop a slight crust within a few hours. This is normal. It is the silicate at the surface reacting with atmospheric carbon dioxide. Do not disturb this crust. It is sealing the surface and helping to retain moisture in the interior. After about 24 hours, you can mist the surface lightly with water if the weather is dry, to prevent the surface from drying out before the interior has cured. After 72 hours, the material should be hard enough to walk on. After 2 weeks, it should be hard enough to take light loads. After 90 days, it will have reached approximately 90% of its ultimate strength, and it will continue to gain strength slowly for the next several years. Once it is fully cured, you treat it like stone. You can drill it with a masonry bit, you can cut it with a diamond blade, you can patch it if you damage it by chipping out the damaged area and pouring fresh silicate sand into the void. The new material will bond chemically with the old because the chemistry is the same. This is something concrete cannot do well. A concrete patch is always a weak point. A silicate patch is part of the original material. I am going to stop there for tonight because I want to leave room for the conversation in the comments. But I want you to know, before you go, that what you have just learned is not theoretical. It is not experimental. It is not a project that someone is trying to bring to market. It is a building technique with a documented history going back almost 200 years, with verified performance data, with active practitioners in this country today, and with applications that range from a small garden planter you can pour this weekend to a foundation that will outlast your house. The reason you have not heard of it is not because it does not work. The reason you have not heard of it is because the industries that profit from concrete have spent a century making sure you did not. That ends for you tonight. What you do with that knowledge is up to you.